Hi, I'm Gary White for Central Kentucky Television. I'm here with Dixie Hibbs. We're in Bardstown, and Dixie is a local historian for Bardstown and Nelson County, and pretty much Central Kentucky, too. You have some history going all around, don't you?
Yeah.
A former mayor here in Bardstown.
Yes.
You have a lot of history here. And were you originally born here in Bardstown?
Yes. Well, actually, I was born in Louisville, like a lot of people, because we didn't have a hospital here in Bardstown.
Okay.
Okay, on that. But I 70 of my 72 years, I've been living here.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
And you're also a quilt addict.
A quilt addict. You know, I introduced myself, and being a quilt addict is a fun occupation, a fun addiction, I guess is a better term. I became interested in quilts because my grandmother Dixie was a quilter, and her mother was a quilter. And at the age of 6, she taught me how to make a sock monkey. You know the sock monkeys? Well, you actually made them out of the old socks, out of the work socks. And I'm up in eastern Kentucky at a coal mine, a coal camp house with her, and she hands me the needle and the thread and the monkey and the stuffing, and the next thing you know, I've got a very strange looking monkey. But that was my first experience in sewing, and I've been sewing ever since.
Fantastic.
I love quilts for 2 reasons. One, they are the product of a craftsman, either a woman or a man, an artist, and they've taken their needle and their thread and their scissors and the scraps, or maybe they go out and buy new material. But most of the quilts that I really like are the scrap quilts. And when you look at a quilt, you can really get a story from it. You can look at it. You've got formal quilts like the rose we're looking at there. You've got the more informal like the little Sunbonnet Sue behind me. And that's called a tacked quilt. Can you see the difference in that quilt and the others?
Yeah. Is it here? Yeah.
See these little things here? They are actual crochet threads. And instead of quilting, going through 3 layers, the top, the bottom, and the middle are the 3 layers of a quilt. Instead of going through there with a needle and thread making long stitches, even stitches, you take the thread and you just tack it ever so often to keep it together. It's a quick way to make a quilt. We still do it. It was a way that often they work what I call the country work quilts, where they actually were sleeping under them every night. They had to have something quick. And then too, years ago, people would take the old shabby quilts, they would put a new top on them, tack them out like this, and keep using them. They never threw anything away.
Right.
That's why we have wonderful examples of fabrics from different periods. When someone will say, how do you know the age of a quilt? Well, I look at it, I look at the design, I look at what patterns are in it, I kind of look and see how well it's done. Though every period of quilting has really good experts, sometimes you can look at it and say, that was done in the 1940s. They were going out and buying new quilts, new blankets and all. They didn't need the old ones, and very few people were quilting in the 1940s. In the 1930s, everybody was quilting. They didn't have any money.
Right.
No money. It was during the Depression. They would gather scraps, they would share them with their friends, they would put together wonderful, wonderful quilts. Grandmother's flower garden, double wedding ring, all these different patterns. And you're trying to imagine, what in the world is grandmother's flower garden?
How many patterns are there?
Oh, hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
Because a pattern in Pennsylvania may be called something different in Washington State.
Okay.
Because it was what it reminded somebody of. This is a blazing star behind you there. That's an 1880s quilt. The big pink and the brown?
Yeah.
1880s. It's in wonderful shape for that. Most of the time when we find quilts of that period with brown in them, the brown has disintegrated. The dye that went in the brown fabric ate itself. I mean, there was a chemical in it that literally destroyed the fabric.
Really?
So when we find a quilt that has the brown intact, we just feel like we found treasure. And that one is in very, very good shape. And it has great quilting in it. Now the quilting are the stitches that are holding all 3 layers together, and they're usually in patterns. They are in grids, circles. Sometimes they're just straight lines just to hold it till while they use it. Others, they have all types of decorative things with it. In that part.
So like this half moon here is what you're talking about?
Yes, that's a pattern of the quilting. And that particular quilt is interesting because it's a kit quilt. If you didn't want to go save all your fabrics and get your patterns and things, you could go buy everything in a kit. You know, we're big on kits in America. Just give us a kit and we'll build an Empire State Building.
Exactly.
But this one, and it's a beautiful quilt, just really, really pretty. It has applique, which is the addition of fabric over the top of another fabric. Applying, see, applique?
Okay.
All right. It has handwork, and that they took and they sewed on all of these leaves and rose petals with what we call a buttonhole stitch. If you did it on your sewing machine, it would be a satin stitch. back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You did it by hand. It's called a buttonhole stitch. It even has tiny little thorns on this kind of rambling rose. And this is the border. This isn't even the middle. The middle is made up of the grids with the roses, you can see. And I know it's a kit quilt because the little tiny dots are still on the fabric that showed them where to quilt. See the tiny blue dots? This has been washed and it's been used. But those little dots were put on there. When the lady bought the kit, she had a top. All of this was together. It was marked. She had pink fabric in 3 different shades here. She had her green fabric. She had her embroidery thread. Everything was in the quilt. She had the blue sashing here. We call that sashing when you're joining together. Now that sashing was sewn on by machine. And I think that was on there when she bought it. I don't think she put it on. I think it was on the kit when she bought it.
Okay.
But she quilted right through it, see?
Yeah.
And that's what she should do. She on that part. Whoever did this, and it wasn't done in Kentucky, I'm sorry to say, was an expert quilter. And one of the ways you can tell expert quilting is to look at the back of the quilt. And it's very hard to see, I'm sure, but all of the little puffy places on it. See how you can tell how it's all there? The more of those there are on a quilt, to me, the more valuable they are. I really, really like quilting on a quilt. Now, I'm going to use this quilt as an example of what not to do.
Okay.
This wonderful quilt was put on the bed, and at some point, the sun came through the window. And if you can see the difference in color, all the green has disappeared. See that right there? Just shows you. This was far enough out of the sunlight it didn't fade, but all of this has faded. And that took half the value of this quilt away. Even though it's still very useful, there's nothing wrong, it's not coming apart. When you look at it and you think, oh, it's faded. So if you have quilts in your family and you're using them, and I want people to use them, be careful where you put them. Do not put them where the sunlight hits them. Even though some of the old fabrics will not fade like this, you don't know until it's too late. Now, this quilt needs a home. It needs a home where this side, where it's faded, will be over next to the wall where you don't see it. And you won't walk in on it. But that's one of the things that I guess I like to do best. I like to save quilts. I like to take them when they're torn up and fix them. And we'll talk about that later. But this was a great example of what not to do with your fine quilt. Do not lay it out in the sunlight.
Right. Get
like
that fading going on. Well, that's a shame. Now, what period? This is
1950s.
50s, you said, right? Yeah.
50s. And we've got some stain on it there, but we're not worried about that. A little bit of stain, it's kind of like beauty marks on us. You know, a little bit of age spot is not going to character, yes. When they're dirty, I wash them. I have a special powder I wash them in. But most of the time, I just try to keep them from getting dirty like that. You don't want to wash them every month like we do our clothing and stuff. You maybe once a year if they're really, really dirty, and then they've got to be have the oil from your hands and actual dirt on them, not just dusty kind of thing.
Yeah.
Behind me, too, you have the fan quilt. You can see it right behind me. I'm going to look at it this way. That is the 1930s. Now, how I can tell are the fabrics, the design. 1930s, during Depression, everybody saved their scraps. They shared them with each other. They had quilting bees we talk about. They got together in the churches and all, and they would produce these wonderful quilts. Sometimes they raised money with them. They would have a lottery or a what am I saying? Like you buy tickets and
raffle.
Raffle. Thank you. They would have a raffle, and they would raise money for their church. And I saw a quilt about 10 years ago that had been used to buy a piano for a country church. They had sold tickets for like a nickel a piece, and they'd made this wonderful quilt. They went out and took their chickens and went and traded at the general store to get fabric to make it and all of that. And it was a great story about how the women of the church wanted a piano, and they couldn't afford it, but they made the quilt, raffled it off, and got enough money to buy a piano. So quilts are full of stories like that.
Right.
And everyone's community, everybody's family probably has a story about a quilt. One other thing I brought with me today is a modern quilt. This is what we call computerized quilting. Quilting machines, sewing machines have been used since the 1850s. We've had sewing machines since the 1850s. Most of the time, people use them just to construct clothing, but sometimes they would go out and use them on their quilts. It really wasn't very successful on the quilts. They would sew their pieces together and things like that, but they very seldom quilted with it. In our modern age, we are doing what they call computerized quilting. you have huge quilting machines that are almost as big as this room. And they put the back and the batting and the top fabric on it. They use their computer to put their design in it and what they want to quilt it. Now in this case, this is a blue embroidery design. It's called a sampler because there's so many different designs in it. It's a king-size quilt, and it has this wonderful border on it. I brought this particularly for the border because you see it's grid quilted, very close. A sewing machine can do this very easily. The quilting on this machine, quilting on this quilt probably took her about 4 months to do. Wow. Now, she didn't quilt every minute of every day. She cooked her food, she washed the clothes, but when she had a chance, she went and quilted on her quilt. Now, I say that, it might have taken her a year. The whole quilt probably did take a year because the top had to be a lot of work on it. This machine, the computerized quilting machine, could do this quilt in about 20 minutes. As an example of difference. Now, do I value this quilt less than that one? Yes, because a woman took her needle and thread, she took her spare time, she took her desire to create something beautiful, and she worked and worked at that. This is to be used. We put this on a bed. If the cat gets on it, I'm not going to get upset because I can go get another one.
Right.
We can't go get another one of those. They're very rare like that. So nothing wrong with computerized quilting. Nothing wrong with us using quilts on our beds now like this. Just remember, if you can replace it, use it. Don't grieve over it if the cat or dog gets on it, or if you spill jelly, your children get jelly, peanut butter or jelly on it. But if you have a fine quilt in your family, love it, respect it, and use it. Put it out and let your children, grandchildren see it. Talk about who made it. If you've got a picture of the person who made it, put that close by too, because they made it with love in their hearts and in their hands, and they wanted people to appreciate it.
Right.
Women are competitive. Have you noticed that? Women are competitive. No. There's nothing more competitive than the sewing women. The women that were quilting and crocheting and doing all this wonderful things. Women are always being competitive. So it was a great social thing, and it was a great achieving thing that the women could say they got a blue ribbon at the fair, or that their quilt was copied. Their pattern of their quilt, somebody copied it. Now that was flattering, that you had a quilt pattern or something you'd made and your friend wanted a copy of it or a pattern of it, kind of thing there. But I would love to talk about quilts, and I will talk some more about them. And I hope we're going to talk more about history. In Nelson County, we have, the homemakers are over 100 years old. Excuse me. Records of people making things and having raffles and raising money with their items goes back over 150 years. I do not have a quilt older than 150 years. I have some pieces that are that old. But most of the time my favorite period of quilting is the 1880s to 1910. And when you look at my house and my collection and the ones I buy to resell, they're heavy on 1880s to 1910 because I like the dark wines and the wines and the blues and the blacks and all that period have a lot of that in it.
So it's a darker.
It is because
tones.
People in the Victorian age, they had access. They had what we call mourning fabrics, where someone would die and they go make a dress in mourning, and there were little black and white fabrics. Some of them are black with a little bit of white on them, and some of them are vice versa. And you had a lot of dark colors then. And they lasted pretty well, better than the browns. The browns and some of the yellows with brown in them, and there's a lot of pieces like that. And I hope we'll talk about that again too.
That's great. So is quilting uniquely an American craft?
No, it's not. But each country has different favorites of patterns and ways to do things. I think that we are fortunate enough in America that even the early settlers, they brought the desire to do this with them. And if they came from Scandinavia, they liked certain colors, they liked certain designs. If they came from Italy, again, they had a different, not talent, they had a different choice, I guess. They wanted things in a different way. And of course, we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast and took all of these patterns and ideas with us. They often say, I know there was a story told about the lady in Washington State. it was Washington Territory at the time. They had settled there. They had a log cabin. She was trying to finish a quilt. She was trying to make this quilt, and she broke the only needle she had. The only needle. Now today we would jump in, run to Walmart, go down to the fabric shop, and we'd get a whole package of needles. She's out in the middle of nowhere. And maybe she would get to the store in a month or maybe 6 months. Maybe they just went and they won't go again for 6 months. She got on her horse. She told her husband to watch the children and she'd be back. And she rode 25 miles to her neighbor and borrowed a needle and rode back. And she promised she'd take really good care of that needle because it was the only one she had.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, I'm not riding 25 miles for a needle.
Yeah.
But I can understand her doing that because this was her relaxation. It was her ability to create something. This was her way to be special in her family. And she couldn't do it without the needle.
Yeah.
Those were her tools.
Special for her.
Yeah, that way.
Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk some more about quilting, and we have some little pieces and get some more of the history with that and stuff going on, right?
You sure can.
Great. So stay with us. We'll be right back here on Central Kentucky Television.